So official hello to everyone. Today we are listening to Alec Kozicki, who is a colleague of mine from Tartu. He's originally from Marietta, Georgia, and is doing his PhD in the semiotics program in Tartu, and his research focuses on techno-living spaces, or the design of techno-living spaces. And today he's going to talk about the concept of semiosphere as it relates to AI artifacts, and yeah, so we'll see what we can borrow from this idea from semiotics. And yeah, just a reminder then that we are recording the session, and anybody who doesn't want to be seen or heard, then you are welcome to post your questions in the chat, which is not recorded, or if you want to switch on your camera, then just be aware that it will be in YouTube later on. But yeah, so Alec, on to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and so today I will do a presentation. It's the fine line between academia and industry. So it's not purely theory that I'll talk about today. It will be more so about looking at how we can apply theory to the current state of, how we incorporate AI into the society. So it's a part mixture of the research I do within the PhD program, but it's also associated to me as a semiotic consultant. So, and that's associated to my company called Semiosphere, registered in Estonia. So to begin, I always like to incorporate what is semiotics, just so everyone can understand how I am approaching what is semiotics. So in the general sense, it's the science of signs and sign systems. What Farouk Seif talks about is how it's the modeling of what is true versus what is real. So this is what I focus on when it comes to modeling paradoxes. And my definition of semiotics, it relates to the inquiry of what is presently at hand, what is remembered from the past, and what is envisioned of the future. So it incorporates the past, present, and future aspects, which we related to representation, memory, and anticipation. So what this presentation looks at is more so what is presently at hand, because I was doing a deep dive on how AI has been used within the past decade and what it's currently being used for in different societies. And when it comes to utilizing semiotics as an apparatus, it's very impactful on how we co-develop in an environment, such as using the resources, competence, affordances, and scaffolding. So these four semiotic components are what I focus on in my dissertation, looking at how we develop in techno living spaces, for that matter, whether it's smart homes or virtual reality or any other technological environment that we incorporate into our living space. So using these four components, it allows us to understand how meaning making is structured and how we can actually reconstruct the objects around us to provide more meaning. So as a little oversight of what I do as like a semiotic consultant, the main thing I wanted to focus on is the goal. So me as a consultant, my goal is to help with the process of cultural perception and action regarding the planetary boundaries of the Anthropocene. And this figure on the right is the different planetary boundaries that have been identified, and more are being computed, and actually the scientific truth is still being identified for some of these. So when it comes to modeling the paradox of what is true versus what is real, these scientific truths, such as climate change or the biodiversity, these are all truths that we as semioticians have to know how to translate it into what is real. So this is very essential when it comes to the semiosphere, because we can look at it as a global sort of entity, but we can also look at it more from like the specific cultural entity. So that's why, as a consultant, I use this as like my cornerstone to orient my meaning when it comes to what I do with design and also what I do with research. So, from the research emerges from design and it's oriented towards the goal. But today, I want to focus more on the semiosphere. So rather than talking about Lotman's core aspects of the core, the periphery, and the boundaries, and the other aspects of the semiosphere, I wanted to bring in John Hartley's aspect of what is creativity within the semiosphere. So, as Alexei Semenenko wrote, is that the semiosphere itself is both an object of analysis and a meta concept, and it's can be used to study cognition. So for this, we can look at the semiosphere as a whole object for the world itself, or we can break it down into specific cultures. And what what he talks about is he identified at least 17 different definitions that each complement one another of what the semiosphere is. And he concludes by saying the semiosphere defined as a space of qualitative, incommensurable diversity. So with this, it's more so related to this translation process. And this is exactly what John Hartley says on the last quote, that the elementary act of thinking is translation. So as a consultant, my focus is knowing how we can take these global truths and know how we can integrate it into cultures to actually create a benefit impact, not only for the actual localized cultural, but also for the overall planet, for that matter. And to get into John Hartley's model, he identifies 4 different creative industries. And I created this figure to show how they're broken down, whether it's the industry definition, which relates to creative clusters, the creative services, which relates to the economic services, creative citizens, which relates to the cultural definition, and creative cities, which is the combination of the other 3. So for this presentation, my focus was to explore all 4 of these creative industries to see where has AI been implemented in what sort of industries or what sort of economic sectors or what sort of artistic text, for instance. What I've found is that this, what Hartley calls CI-2, the creative services, this is the one that has been the most revealing in a way, such as the creative services. These are inputs by specific occupations and companies that are adding value, essentially, whether it's within creative services or in non-creative sectors, such as health and government, which I'll show examples about that. So when it comes to these creative services, it's more so it's creation with inside an entity that is then being provided to an end user, whether it's a different business or the consumer or government for that matter. But essentially, as it writes at the end, is creative input is high value added, stimulating the economy as a whole and boosting innovation in otherwise static sectors. So this is significant when it comes to AI because it allows us to rethink different approaches on how we can do something like manufacturing or insurance or even shopping for that matter. So this is essentially what I'll be focusing on today, exploring these 4 different creative industries and seeing what's out there. To begin though, it's essential to understand that the policy making is very much essential when it comes to computing these truths into what is real. And right now, this is kind of up in the air when it comes to legislation. And I have a lot of different references, like you can see in the brackets 1, 2, and 3. So if you do want to have any sort of, if you want to look at these notes, feel free to reach out to me and I can provide them for you. The USA, they provided a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. However, it's more so, it's not really set in stone on what they're trying to accomplish or what they're trying to incorporate into their Bill of Rights. However, what the European Parliament provided is a little bit more of an active voice, such as they identify what AI systems, what levels of unacceptable level of risk, such as deploying subliminal or purposefully manipulative techniques or exploiting people's vulnerabilities that are used for social scoring. So within the EU, they made it a little bit more explicit on what they are trying to achieve by creating legislation. And when it comes to the process of legislation, the OECD organization, they provided a policy cycle. And this breaks down how the policy design should work. So I wanted to incorporate that in there to just kind of have an oversight on how it's related to not only the culture, but it's also related to the government, and it's also related to the different organizations that are trying to at least make sure it's fair for everyone. And as a first example, there's these two marketing ads, which falls underneath the creative clusters, because this relates to the industry itself, because it's used for advertising purposes. And this is in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where initially McDonald's created the ad that, in English, it translates to what is the most iconic burger in the world. And they used ChatGPT's response to create an ad from it. The very next day, Burger King responded with, and which one is the biggest? So you can see how the consumers are being oriented through marketing strategies by these truths that are incorporated into ChatGPT. And it's very interesting how they put them right side by side with each other. Even the structural aspect of these texts mimic one another. The only really difference is the actual logo on the bottom. Other than that, you look at it and you think it's a human that wrote it, but at the same time, you can see that it says answered by ChatGPT, and you understand that it's creating a creative output that is different than relying on someone within the marketing team to create this writing. So this is one example of how advertisements is changing because of AI. Another one that specifically is focused on transportation in Estonia. The top right image relates to Starship Technologies' autonomous delivery robots. They've been around for around a decade or so, and you see them in Tallinn pretty much everywhere. And they even now are partnered with Bolt Food for courier service as well. And another one on the bottom right image, this is an autonomous public transport vehicle. It's initially started as a solar powered vehicle, but in 2020 they partnered up with the University of Tartu to create a hydrogen powered vehicle. I remember being in this. I rode in this car one time, and it definitely felt like the future. There was no steering wheel. There was a screen on the side of on the bus that showed you the path that it was taking, and there was a guy in the bus that showed the actual schematics of what the bus saw. So it was a very futuristic feeling being in this bus. And on top of that, University of Tartu also partnered with Bolt to create an autonomous vehicle to offer on their ride hailing platform. So for them, they have the goal to have it out by 2026. They've been doing it for a few years now so far on the actual testing and understanding what sort of technologies is essential, whether it's using LiDAR technology or any other sensors for that matter. So within Estonia, even though the population is 1.2 million, it is pretty interesting how it's a perfect society for trying these new modes of transportation, whether it is for delivery or public transportation or even for ride hailing. And also the car I add. It's an automotive software company established by Volkswagen Group that they make the AI technology for their cars. And earlier this year, I was at a conference listening to one of their representatives talk about what they have in store. So the presenter he broke down three different aspects. The first aspect, how it relates to the technological developments which they have done so far. Right now, the second stage is in the legislative aspect, because the data from the cars are from all over the world. So it's more so them having to understand, how can we use this data from one culture and one sort of transportation environment, and how can we relate it to China, for instance. So right now, that's the main barrier that they were experiencing. The third barrier that he talked about was the psychological impact of what it's like to get into a car without a steering wheel. That's something where they were still very much looking into, to understand the actual impact of the psychological understanding of, like, do you feel safe when you get into a car without a steering wheel? Even then, they were talking about in their cars, they want to create it that has when you get into your car and you drive, you let the car drive, and they want the whole car to be an entertainment vessel, essentially. So if your friends are at home watching television or like a sports game, they're trying to make it where you can still be in your car and watch the game in your car. So it's a really interesting aspect of being immersed. So that's something in the future, once this technology is out, I definitely want to look more into, being immersed inside your own vehicle. Another interesting one is the digitalization of insurance. This one, I identified it as a creative service, more so because of this graph, because we can see in this graph that there's different aspects that have different sort of economic services. And one of the interesting things that I found while doing this research is that if you Google, for instance, insurance and AI, or digitalization of AI in insurance, you will find a lot of different consulting companies providing blog entries or sort of like reports on why these insurance companies should integrate AI into their systems. So from the creative cluster aspect, which relates to the industry, that's where the consulting firms are related to. But when it comes to the actual process of insurance, I put this within creative services, because what's happening, I associated it with the value added to non-creative sectors. So it helps create more of a fluid process rather than very static, in the sense of having to do paperwork and having to manually do all this. So by digitalizing insurance, it's helping so many different aspects, whether it comes to open water insurance. It's allowing different traders from global trading to cut down the process of having to submit insurance reports. So it's making a global impact, not only from the one individual user, but from the actual entirety of the whole economic market. Another one is that relates to commerce is what I call nurturing the pig industry. And this one was very much focused in China. Because I remember a few years back, I remember seeing a YouTube video about how facial recognition was used to monitor the perceived happiness of a pig in a slaughterhouse. And when I put on YouTube this, facial recognition of pigs, you will get, endless amount of videos. And one of them is, it's a venture invested by JD.com. And their goal is to use 5G technology to detect disease, to track a pig's facial recognition, and to create automated feeding. And their goal of this is that it decreases, in the currency conversion, $11.30 per pig. So, it rather than focusing on like the true state of the pig's happiness, using it for the technology for the pig, you can see how it's being used for consumerism as opposed as the end user for the pig. So, it's something where the semioethical aspect, you could easily dive farther into it, but, essentially it's intended to help farmers understand how to create the highest yield and the most, qualitative aspect of the yield. So what they're trying to do is understand when a pig's behavior, for instance, if they're starting to bite, how can the system understand when to remove this specific pig out of the kennel and put them into a different location. So this is currently the aspect that the technology is trying to figure out, how to incorporate this logic rather than just being able to identify these signals. Another instance is Alibaba. They have what is called the ET agricultural brain. Right now, it is being used for the pig industry, and it's been around since like 2018. But their plan is to incorporate this into different sectors, such as forestry and fisheries. So once this technology becomes a part of forestry and fisheries, it would move out of creative services into creative clusters. That's when the creative clusters rely on different industries working together to create innovation. However, right now, this technology, it's being used specifically for one type of sector, such as the pig industry. Another example of commerce is the shopping experience of the USA. And I have another example about the biometric aspects, because some of the examples of biometric feedback includes body movements to understand where you are, or like what sort of actions you do in a specific space, how long you were actually shopping in the store. It also does eye scans, and it relies on spatial proxemics, such as knowing where the points of locations you go in the store, what paths you take, and so on, and voice prints. And when it comes to stores using these biometric sensors, you can see in the picture in the middle that you have to have a piece of paper showing that this company uses biometric data. So this is currently a part of the legislation in place, which again, it varies state by state, so it changes. But one of the interesting aspects is the fact that the US is experiencing a shoplifting epidemic. So it's one of these things. When I was doing the research about this, anti-theft, anti-shoplifting technology, it's been around for like over a decade so far. There's been, mom and pop grocery stores that have had this technology for, well over 5 years already. So, when it comes to these big chain corporations having this technology, it's nothing really new when it comes to using it for anti-shoplifting. However, what is new is, like you can see in the picture on the right, is that the aisles don't even have like some of the actual products anymore. So, it's one of these things that like when you're modeling how technology is becoming integrated within societies, you can see that the biometric data provides one thing, but the actual problem is that shoplifting is occurring. So with this sort of experience, we have to find a common ground of what's the actual impact of using biometric data, while at the same time, the stores don't even have the actual products. Like you still have to get someone's attention to get the product. So this is something that it will be interesting to see how this unfolds within the next few years, state by state, because each one of them have their own legislation and their own sort of subcultural aspects of the shoplifting epidemic. When it comes to creative cities, I wanted to bring into the conversation human-centered design. And these are two examples of how AI has been utilized to contribute to this notion of human-centered design. So like on the image on the left, it's this company called Layout, and it's used for modeling workspace environments. So it's very useful to have a sort of a blueprint on what you want to do with a specific space, but it's a algorithm telling you what to do in this space. And on the picture on the right, this is an artist that uses AI to create utopic images of what future cities could look like. And sure, there's a lot of greenery, there's a lot of white, there's a lot of light as well, a lot of openness. However, the AI itself does not know how to model the environment. It doesn't know the actual understanding of the actual biodiversity in the trees, or the actual relations of the semiotic components, such as affordances, competence, scaffolding, and resources. It has no recognition of these four semiotic components. So this is something where when we start incorporating AI into human-centered design, we should take it with a grain of salt to make us be aware that it can lead us further away from the environment that we are currently in, because it's one of those things that we have more sensory information than AI to understand what this office space should consist of, or what the future city should provide for its inhabitants. This image, for instance, it's just a prompt that the artist put in. So it's more so, if we want to incorporate AI into the conceptualization of human-centered design, we must understand what is the environment and how can we actually do justice on how to co-develop in this environment that's being conceptualized with AI. So that's my sort of stance on what we should do within human-centered design with AI. And as another example of public space and creative cities, New York City, man, they have quite some interesting things when it comes to like facial recognition, AI, and just overall new technologies being integrated into the city. One of them is a science experiment done by Wendy Yu, and she teaches now at Cornell University. She started this experiment when she taught at Stanford as well too, but she created robotic trash barrels, and the trash barrels were just put on motors, and they had a GoPro on it, and the robots would walk, or it would drive up to different people sitting at different tables in the city around Times Square area, and they were analyzing how people were interacting with the trash cans. So this one is a very fascinating aspect on what happens when we sort of give these objects agency within the city space. So even though it's not AI focused, I wanted to incorporate it into how, just by putting wheels on a trash can, how it's changing our perception and our interactions within the city. But on a more pressing matter is that the city itself, the police department, they have over 15,000 cameras used for surveillance and for facial recognition. And a nonprofit organization, they were the ones who mapped out these cameras because this information was not disclosed to the public on where these cameras were, what they were used for, and so on. So Amnesty International, they were the ones responsible for mapping it out and kind of being the watchdogs of the surveillance on, how citizens are being surveilled within this public space. The image you see on the right is what is called the Nightscope K5 robot. And it's interesting because the city of the New York Police Department is renting this for 6 months at $9 an hour. And it's something where you can see all the different technologies and artifacts it incorporates into it. But the fact that they just have it for 6 months kind of emphasizes that it's more so of a testing to see the actual social acceptance of a use case, for instance. What's the actual impact of putting this egg-like robot that just moves freely around the town? So that's something that it will be interesting to look more into once they finish renting out this robot. And another organization that is competing with the New York Police Department, it's called STOP. And STOP and Amnesty International are the main two nonprofits who are clashing with the actual police department, because there's a big issue of turning into a surveillance state. So right now they're suing the police department for systematically hiding public records, and hiding the public records relates to what they use their spending budget for, in relation to the 15,000 cameras that were used for surveillance and facial recognition. So New York, it's a perfect place to do a deep dive on how AI is becoming integrated into a creative city, because the creative city aspect relates to how the urban mixture of the industry, the economic services, and the citizens, how they all come in interaction with one another, and through this clashing, this is where meaning is emerging, such as, is it are you able to not live in a surveillance state, or are you able to actually have some sort of opinion or actual meaning making associated to what technologies are actually incorporated into it? So it will be interesting to see what happens in New York within the next few years. And continuing the aspect of New York, one of the current sort of ongoing legal cases it relates to the creative city versus the creative cluster. And these two creative industries are essentially clashing with one another. So I attached the case number, which you can find online, and I have the document in the files as well too. But it relates to a new law called the Biometric Identifier Information Law. Essentially, it relates back to that poster I showed of how each store has to identify that, hey, we have biometric data that we collect, retain, convert, store, and share. And failing to do this is a failure of abiding by the law. So this law came into effect in 2021, but it wasn't put into action until like early 2022. January 15th, 2022 is when the law was put into ruling. But Amazon Go, which is like the no employee store, it's purely automated. They did not notify the customers that biometric data was being used. And even at the last bullet point or the last quotation, you can see how the location at Rockefeller Plaza, it has 6 different doors placed side by side, but the store, Amazon, only put one small sign at the end of the farthest door. So it's one of those things when it comes to making it explicit, or using like ostensible signs of, clearly indicating the impact of what happens when you walk into the store and what sort of data you are providing for them. This is something where, this legislation hopefully does make an impact on how we understand what the significance of biometric data is and what it's being used for, and how much choice we have in the matter. when we go into these, automated stores. So at the moment, this is the main sort of legislation that's happening when it comes to, these biometric sensors being used within stores. And as a final example, this one you could probably talk about for days when it comes to the different legality aspects of the creative clusters, so the entire industries clashing with creative citizens. Because within this presentation, I didn't focus more so on creative citizens, because you could easily go on YouTube and type in AI commercial or AI song for that matter, or we've seen all the different Dolly images that users have created. So the actual use case of creative citizens, it is pretty much there when it comes to the public consensus. However, it's the clashing of the different creative industries that is creating the emergence of meaning. And what John Hartley writes is, rather than being seen as the output of an industry, creative innovation becomes a property of complex systems, socially networked relations, and the interaction of cultural and economic activities. Furthermore, social networks themselves are sources of innovation. They're not simply distribution media. The force of innovation comes from CI3 is putting pressure on CI1. So the creative citizens putting pressure on creative clusters. And this can be seen in the realm of intellectual property rights, which were heavily skewed towards industrial providers. The rights of those who wanted to copy and share creative content were not recognized. And in Hartley's article, he tries to get the point across that culture itself is a part of the creative process. And the way legislation is designed, it does not feed into consideration how culture creates. And this is something where the notion of creativity, we look at it more so as the industry perspective or from the economic service perspective. We as the consumers or the users or the prosumers, the producing consumers, we are the ones that don't really have the same rights as the creative clusters. And this is something where it's interesting because so much of the meaning making that we associate to creation with technology, it's funneled by the creative clusters because it's something that we can see it in, like in the bottom left, the different types of text clashing over intellectual property rights. This can relate to visual text. Such as all the different sort of visual platforms that are not providing, any sort of, they're not getting access by the actual artists themselves to use the artwork when it comes to training these data sets. So the visual aspect, it's something that is very much there. And within that article, it's titled The Year of AI Lawsuits. So, we're halfway in this year, so it'd be interesting to see, what else emerges the rest of the year as well. But even then, one aspect that is interesting is the music industry. On the quote on the right, it emphasizes UMG, which is one of the biggest sort of record labels in the world. Michael Nash, who works there, says that we own all sounds captured on a sound recording. That is, in fact, the very nature of sound recording, copyright, and ownership. And here too, depending on the instance, we may also employ name and likeness, voice impersonation, right of publicity protections as well. So what they are trying to focus on is not only how to protect the actual intellectual property of the song, but how to protect the artist's identity as well, such as creating, I don't know, there's been albums that are completely made by AI. So like you can type in Travis Scott, Utope AI, and it's just albums that are purely AI. So it sounds like the rapper, but yet it is not in fact the rapper. So it's one of these things that when it comes to the representation, like this iconicity of the actual artist, or a president for that matter, this is something where legislation, we haven't even started the legislation yet when it comes to the musical ownership and the likeness of the ownership. And one of the aspects too I wanted to incorporate is the patenting process, because there's this one AI advocate, Scott Toller, who he was trying to get a patent for a technology or for an object that his AI system created. And essentially the patenting office said, no, the creator that's applying for the patent has to be human. So when it comes to, patenting, it's pretty much set in stone, who can apply for a patent. A human can. But when it comes to the copyright aspects, this is something where these different AI lawsuits, it will be focused more so on like the copywriting approach rather than the actual innovation or invention aspects, such as related to patenting. So in the future, the best thing to do is to keep an eye on how these different creative industries are competing with one another, such as the clusters and the citizens, or the clusters and the cities, or even the economic services and the clusters. So there's a lot of different ways we can understand how AI is becoming integrated into society. Because if we just look at it in terms of, okay, what is the core, what is periphery, what is the boundary, it becomes easy to overlook the actual way this technology is becoming integrated within our day-to-day life, because so much of it it's hidden out of plain sight, such as the way we do insurance, the transportation we do, the way we do shopping, the entertainment we do, and so on. So all of these different systems within society, they are being impacted in one way or the other by AI, and I see it just as a start. I don't see it anywhere coming to an end anytime soon. And with this, these are the different internet links that I bracketed. So if you want access to those, feel free to let me know. And those are the academic references. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. It was a super, super interesting and like a very good categorization of various issues that we have. I'm sure there's a lot of other issues that also can be probably added in these clusters and so on. But I don't know. I had like a lot of ideas which I jotted down during your talk. Maybe I'll just start off with a couple of those, and if anybody else feels they want to ask a question, then just raise your hand or write in the chat or just speak up. But maybe just to start off, like for a very simple clarification of the semiosphere, because I don't think you explicitly gave like a very intro definition to that. Do you want to do that, or is it just I mean, in semiotics we generally think semiosphere as like the totality of anything that people do during their sign actions or whatever. So like also it's related to the Vernadsky's biosphere noosphere, but like a noosphere is supposed to be like rational thought or something, so semiosphere would be like probably all of thought.
Yeah, I mean, with this, I wanted to try to get away from like the truly the Lotmanian sense of like what is the semiosphere. I wanted to look more at it from the application of like, putting it more into use for that matter, because like with as the semiosphere itself, how I define it is it's where meaning emerges, and it's where cultural systems reside. So, it's one of those things that like since my like goal as a consultant is the global aspect of the semiosphere, it's just such a huge thing to truly model, you know. So that's where I wanted to start with Hartley's model of understanding, okay, how are we creating with AI, and in what sort of instances, is it only related to industry, or is it only related to artistic purposes, or so on. So I wanted to understand what sort of strings are being connected, uh, because it is one of those things that throughout this research, it's more so about machine learning rather than like an embodied AI, you know, robot for that matter. So it's one of those things that whether it is facial recognition for, you know, civilians in New York City, or for the pig industry, or even in shopping centers, you know, it stems from machine learning. So it's more so knowing, you know, what's the next step of the AI, because right now, like for the pig industry, it can tell us the different signals of what the machine is saying or understanding, but it's not able to tell the farmers anything. And this is where the current issue is, because the farmers themselves don't actually see the application of why they need this technology for their pigs, because they know how to interpret the pig's behavior like by already. So it's not really providing anything new in the sense of like creating less of a workload for the actual farmer. So, you know, that's kind of the main sort of instance. But even with like shoplifting technology, it's been designed already for a while that like the system in a way anticipates that someone will shoplift before it happens. But again, this leads into this notion of bias that, is a whole nother topic.
Yeah, I kept thinking when you were talking about that, about like it really sounds like a surveillance dystopia, over in the US. I don't know how much it's used somewhere else, but I know that in the EU AI Act, at least theoretically, there is a ban on biometric surveillance, but well, it's not quite past the legislation yet, I think, but it's like in the course of, and I know that various cities have in the US have actually also banned, I think, police surveillance or something, but yeah, like I kept wondering like how, to what extent is like the actual shoplifting an issue, and then does the biometric whatever, like what has actually more effect, like the sign that says that you are being recorded, or the actual technology behind it? Like, is it actually effective against what it tries to be effective of, and yeah, like how does it affect like vulnerable populations and so on, so maybe who get profiled more often than actually merit. But yeah, I also liked how your approach kind of like highlights again like these human or like company roles behind all those tech solutions, because like when it comes to artists and like AI imitations, or even like virtual influencers and similar phenomena, then what we often read from the media is that oh, AI will copy your voice and do stuff for you, but as you pointed out, they're actually, it's like the interest of music industry to like the companies who sort of like try to reprofit from all the recordings they already have about an artist and create like new.
Because especially with the music industry is a pretty interesting one, because like it's like what I read the other day is that like UMG, for instance, they say they're more than willing to work with, Chat GPT, for instance, on creating, to understand how to come to a consensus on how to create, AI generated music in relation to a specific artist. But the issue at the moment, it's the fact that like, sure, if you're a user, you can create a song using someone's voice, and then you just upload it to TikTok. or you upload it to YouTube or any other platform for that matter. So this is kind of where the issue is, where ChatGPT, especially the older models, it can't detect any sort of copyrighted material. So if you use these older versions, it doesn't know that it's already, copyrighted. But what's happening is that these record labels, they have an issue of posting it to TikTok, for instance. These songs are getting 200,000 plus likes in like a day, and they don't see any monetary return off of it. So that's kind of where the industry itself, it's feeling the impact, because these trends are happening and they're not able to jump on these trends for that matter.
I wonder what the artists would think of that. Like, I mean, I guess for them it's like good if their voice gets remixed in a way. On the other hand, also they don't control it, so I don't know, can be.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't came across any artist who is a fan of AI
Remixed.
Yeah, it's which I get it, yeah. So there's a lot of different, because whether it's the deep fakes or like just the voiceovers or so on, um, yeah, the legislation behind it, it is kind of slow when it comes to that sort of, voice persona or imitation for that matter.
Have you thought about this topic in relation to meme culture, or like how, because I think memes were like the first digital imagery basically that got like copied over and over, and they sort of like take on their own life in a way, like when you think about those template photos of actually existing people that have been memified so that you can add any kind of. So I think there's been stories about that also, like the girl on the meme or something, and then like how it impacted her life later on when her photo just went viral or something. But yeah, like I mean, so there's sort of like a template to analyze this phenomenon, maybe.
Like for me, when it comes to looking at AI research, I try to look at it more from like the commodification aspect, how we are actually commodifying this technology. Because the meme culture, that's not really what I can like model in a way. But even like the poster of McDonald's and Burger King, the news article, it titled it as the AI ad war, just because two posters were created using ChatGPT. So the fact that like, the news outlets are creating this notion of like an ad war just because they're using ChatGPT to do their job, to create an output. It's something that it is quite fascinating, because like, for me, when it comes to what is like how we treat AI, it very much depends on like modeling the true versus what is real. So for me, that's once AI can understand what is real, I won't be so critical in that sense of like how we interact with AI. But when we look at a poster that ChatGPT provided and we take this as truth, that's more so when I have the issue, and how we integrate that into society.
Okay, Etta has raised her hand. So
Okay, do you hear me?
yes.
I'll first comment this last thing that you mentioned about this war of advertisements. I kind of suspect that it's still like you interpret it as an AI-created advertisement. But this is the aspect there were some creative agency who said that let's do an AI-based advertisement because we get attention for that. Because their task is to find ways for companies to get attention. And since this is right now, so there was a creative agency actually probably behind creating this kind of war of AI advertisement. So if it's kind of routine everyday thing, it would not catch attention anymore. and it would not function. So the person who points the finger on what would get the attention is probably still human if we use the AI created advertisement. So I suspect that it's still a process of that goes through creative agency. And whom the companies themselves. It was not McDonald's itself who came out with this idea, but the creative agency who did it for McDonald's. So in this sense, it's not the creative. The AI has been as a tool, not the one who actually created this campaign. But what I initially wanted, you want to comment it?
No, you can continue.
What I initially wanted to ask was the question about, I've understood that the legislation concerning AI and also copyright and are different in different parts of the world. Like you had many examples from the United States, and I've understood that copyright and authorship regulations are different in United States and in Europe, for example. In Europe, it's more like physical person, the author-centered, the creator-centered, while in the United States, it's more a company-centered, a business unit-centered. And also Chinese attitude towards using AI are very different. Would it result in creating different cultures, different AI cultures? Like we have other aspects of culture. Would it also end up in a different culture, different cultural aspect of a society? These different attitudes towards AI reflected, for example, in legislation.
Yeah, I think so. Just because of the in the instance of Cariad, which is creating the software technology for Volkswagen, they have cars all over the world, and they have a big industry in China. However, they cannot use the data in China that's in the EU. So there's this closed boundary of, okay, we have this technology that is in two different countries, for that matter, or two different regions, but there's no sort of translation happening. So the data that is in relation to their machine learning in China has to stay in that culture. It can't be used for any purpose, outside of that region. But when it comes to policy making, it's kind of hard to make any sort of assumption or analysis, because it's so much in the air, for that matter. And I do think in my opinion, I do think the parliaments in Europe will do a good job about the possession of ownership over the authorship of the actual text. But for the US, for instance, whether it comes down to the lobbying groups and so on, I don't know. I see the creative industry having more of an impact or more of a market share for the ownership in the US. So it's one of those things that, from the business perspective, it really comes down to where you copyright your intellectual property to.
Yes, I understand that also,
Yeah.
because these aspects in US and in Europe are quite different.
Because even it's with the biasness in the machine learning, I think that's in a way what we have to currently work on at first, because the technology itself and what sort of use case you want to look at it, it's just so new that it's hard to make an overall consensus of this is what a culture does with it. Right now, it's just kind of going in every direction, exponentially growing, that the consumers, we are kind of starstruck by it, because it's so novel that sure, we want to go possibly to an Amazon Go store, just because it's so unique. It's something that we've never experienced before, or we want to ride in an autonomous vehicle because we've never done it before. So right now, it is the barrier of the psychological process that is having this translation process. and it's more so how we understand. Are we finding the information from like news articles? Are we actually looking at from the research perspective or so on? Because like, for instance, like if you type in music and AI on Google, you will get so many like pop culture articles. But the moment you type in insurance and AI, you get so many consulting articles. So there's a difference on how information is disseminated in relation to like what object it's being integrated to. So doing this research, it was pretty fascinating because I didn't have like a clear goal, for instance. All I wanted to do is kind of see, okay, there's these 4 creative industries. What sort of ones have the most like market share in terms of like the actual technology? So it is interesting because right now it's like the gold rush, essentially. Do it until you can't do it anymore. That's kind of the output that I got from it. Because the policy cycle, it's something that like they don't really know what to do with the policy until something happens. And that's where, that's the interesting aspect. So whether you're a business or a creative user, you might as well do it while you can before the legislation tells you can't, for that matter.
Thank you. Do we have more comments, questions in the room? Okay, maybe I'll go on again then. I kept thinking about how, so there was this recent study from Stanford, I think, the human-centered AI group. So they evaluated this, what they call, so some people call certain language models like foundation models or whatever. But so they evaluated like a bunch of those, including GPT-4 from OpenAI and Llama and others against this AI Act to see like to what extent they actually comply with all the possible legislative requirements, like to reveal your data sources or what amount of data is copyrighted or how you can, and then also there's like requirements for computational energy limits and so on. I can drop the reference to it in the chat, but so I mean, yeah, okay, so in the EU we see like there are constraints on AI. Some people from the US, for example, Sam Altman from OpenAI, he has sort of like rebelled against them a little bit. At some point, they reported him saying that if AI Act will be too strict, then OpenAI will just leave Europe. Now they're like reconciled that it's not going to happen, because obviously something was also maybe they like met his requirements in the EU to an extent. But like, yeah, so there's like a various, and yeah, in the States, yeah, it's been pointed out to me earlier that there's a lot of things that couldn't be developed in the EU in the first place, exactly because of we have like GDPR and we have data regulation rules that are much stricter than in the States, for example. But like, what kind of constraints do you see on these systems or on these developments when you look at the directions you were going in, like in the creative industries and so on? Like, what kind of I don't know, artist backlashes?
I think in like the overall sense, it's the end user that like will have the most reformation, because the industries and the different economic services, it's more or less, it doesn't matter where your company is located. like an insurance company. You can use AI to create a digitalization of your insurance process, or even when it comes to advertising companies incorporating AI into it. So I don't really see if from the company perspective, I don't really see there being truly any issues, but it's more so as the end user. What sort of freedoms do you have, and what sort of abilities can you do with AI? Because right now, from whether it's from the university aspects of the cans and the cannots of using AI for research or for a classroom setting, this is something where sure, maybe it's a global sort of legislation, but it still very much depends on like a specific subculture. So I think that's more so once we start trying to create a bigger picture of how the whole world is interacting with this technology, that's when these individual cultures can try to do something different in a way. But again, that very much depends on the different creative industries giving up power and providing it for culture itself. So I think that's the biggest issue. Because within the EU, I do think culture is taking into the consideration, but like in the US, I do not see creative users having any sort of negotiation power when it comes to ownership of this. So that's something where, yeah, it'd be, I don't know, in a way, that's what I'm the most fearful, if I could say, for like the user itself. Because if so much of the day-to-day life is becoming digitalized and automated, as a consumer, what is physically real for that matter anymore? If everything is computed into data, into biometric sensors and feedback that like you aren't aware of, what are you actually experiencing within physical reality for that matter? So it's something where when it comes to consumerism, I think that will make the biggest impact, whether it is how quick we can ship stuff from China to the USA, how we shop during the shopping center, so on and so on. So within the research, I was trying to not have a consumer-centric point of view. I was trying to look at different sort of industries and everything else, but it all fed into consumerism, like more or less, because right now it's with AI, it doesn't really help with knowledge discovery for that matter. It's not helping us learn anything new. It doesn't know how to think for itself. It's regurgitating what we already know for that matter, from the collective consciousness. So
like not even that. I mean, I don't think
yeah.
it's ever gonna come to be able to generate something really, but it's just, yeah, right now it's like a meat copy of maybe something that humans know, but really some kind of statistical, more or less, like a recycling of our texts, basically, like objectivations or images or whatever, or like whatever they do with the biometric.
Kind of like creating more of the same. Not creating something different, but more of whatever we already have. Like, for example, this example you brought about a CD made out of a rapper's CD, totally created by AI. So it's nothing new. It's just the same music the rapper has produced, but only additional volume of that, probably.
Well, in a sense, I mean, yeah, yes and no, but this actually, yeah, it came up also in a conversation I had about like image generators, and this we are probably going to discuss it more at length in August at the next session, but like the idea that AI image generator, so like Midjourney or whatever, so it's basically, so right now it's sort of like developed based on the average of what is out there, what is like human created art. But if it continues to scrape, like the systems continue to scrape off images from the internet, and right now there's like a proliferation of AI generated imagery already, then it may turn into, you know, like exactly like in a way, then it's going to be more of the same, or like because then the average will be more towards what is the generated, which maybe is more similar to one another, or like lacks any real creativity in this sense. And so yeah, we were discussing about like, so this is kind of like this info apocalypse, or like that we will have like before 2023 and after 2023. So any database that you have scraped off the internet after like now is going to be polluted with like AI content anyway. So yeah, that was kind of, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but
Yeah, well, it's like after like even reflecting over like what I've kind of identified in this research, it's one of those things that most of it didn't, like the way we incorporate AI into our life, I didn't really see how it expands our physiological needs. And this is something where, like, you know, me doing research on like, you know, techno living spaces, I try to look at how technology orients our physiological needs. But when it comes to AI, sure, there might be use cases on like, you know, let's say mental illness and incorporating AI for that matter. But when it comes to that's more so in the academia aspect. It hasn't really seen that much of a real use case for that matter, especially when it comes to modeling it as like creative industries or creative economic services. So even when it comes to in the future, I do hope that AI orients us towards like language acquisition, because like when we can start using AI to understand and to uncover different sort of sign systems that exist like right in front of our eyes, I think that's one way to make the world better, rather than making it very homogenous in the sense how everything is same, which that's in a way more or less where we're going right now. You know, you could type in AI my way Frank Sinatra, and you will get hundreds of different personas singing the song, but it's all the same. You know, there's no sort of originality when it comes to this. So yeah, and from my perspective, I think that's what I would like to see is more applications on like physiological needs rather than consumer needs, because that's, you know, one aspect to it. So yeah, time will tell about that.
what kind of applications would those be?
Well, like just like the higher needs, like relating it to like Maslow's physiological needs. So rather than focusing on like basic needs of like shelter, clothing, heat, and like, you know, warmth or like security for that matter, we can use technology, whether it's virtual reality or smart homes or AI. We can use this towards higher needs to increase our self-esteem, to increase societal relations. So rather than being like secluded, we can understand how to be more open and more empathetic. But really, the higher needs, it relates to skill development, such as learning how to discover knowledge rather than relying on Google or ChatGPT to tell us the knowledge. You know, so it's one of those things that when it comes to these semiotic components of like, especially resources and competence, that's one of the aspects that, as a consultant and as a researcher, this is what I'm trying to put into the industry, how we can utilize these four semiotic components and integrate it into any sort of environment to help us co-develop, because it's a very, very easy theory to put into practice. But again, this relies on, what is presently at hand and where we want to go in the future. So, for me, that's kind of what my research focuses on, more or less.
Okay, Mark, you have a question.
Yeah. I wanted to get more nuanced with it with the last topic under discussion. So yeah, there's the fear that it's getting more homogeneous, or that's the fact that it starts recreating itself. It's even when AI is used in the academy, there is the same fear actually. So you cannot check anymore how well the large language models or something perform when it actually is trained on the same data sets that you would use to see like how accurate it is. So it kind of starts to like, if it incorporates like everything there is and itself, you cannot check it anyhow, and like stuff happens. But the other interesting point is that there's approaches that you can finally tweak the things that are like generating, and then maybe it's not so much AI generation as AI manipulation of things, and things get really interesting there, of course. So one thing is, you type it in and say that, hey, give me a picture of Putin dancing, if that's really what you want. But the other thing is that, hey, but give me the one with this sort of background, with this sort of the style of this era from this culture. And then you can get more and more nuanced. You can start asking that, okay, so what is this? How does the AI actually interpret this different eras or like different cultures? And so give me a picture from a mood lifting weather, and then it makes us question that what is this mood lifting weather actually? I really love the rainy weather, but this is not the sort of the average positive weather that AI would probably generate in there. So maybe there's even possibility of creating ingrained sort of the variety in these AI generation models, just that when we think about it, and the popular things like that OpenAI has provided us, it's often just pretty simple. Just type in a sentence and it might give you something back. It doesn't like, we don't always maybe think of the more like nuances that we might want to put into it. And actually the fact that you could in the end make it a sort of sliders that you can slowly change. It gives you like a space of variability, you can also say. And then you have different options visible in there, and then you can choose something out of it. So this, on the one hand, it's like interesting thing to investigate, but on the other hand, maybe it's also like a solution to this problem of possible homogenization. And I wanted to add this nuance there.
No, I like how that sounds. It's because it creates more like interactivity with the actual technology itself, rather than us inputting just one line of a prompt. We can create different layers of it, which we can start creating like secondary modeling systems at that point with the technology or inside the technology. But for me, my like biggest like critique when it comes to AI is like it not being able to truly model like what is the environment for that matter. Because sure, as a picture, it can understand that, okay, I am designed to create an image. But when it comes to like, because even when we go to a museum or any sort of place that has art, the artwork is always in relation to an environment. So it's one of those things that when we can program the system to understand that, okay, this text is in relation to something bigger than the text itself, that's when we can start co-developing, because the system will have some sort of understanding, more or less competence that like, okay, this one user wanted the backgrounds to look like this. This one user, signifies that this is this type of era. So it creates the different sort of scaffolding process. So I don't know, in a way, that's more of my stance, that like once the AI can start modeling the environment, then it will have more of a closeness to modeling what is real. Because once it has the grounding of, okay, this is an environment, that's when, you know, me and you as users, we can interact with it and say, draw me as a stick figure in Tartu. And, you know, I can specify where in Tartu I want to go and so on, but we can change the actual interpretation of the actual machine rather than just keeping it in this binary opposition. So yeah, for me, you know, I'm nowhere near a computer programmer. But theoretically, that's where I see it needing to go.
So for me, it brings to mind the question of how so all of the generalized AI, how generalized can it get if you want it to be context sensitive, and technically if you end up with well, not millions but billions of variables and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the end, you still have to recognize it, and sort of there is still some sort of ideographic phenomena, and so on. You cannot get around it, and yeah, there is no no straightforward answer to it, of course. Yeah.
Josh.
Sorry. Good morning. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. But yeah, this is a really interesting subtlety that we've turned on to Mark's request. I think it's really interesting, and also building off of Ali's point about it essentially being it begins to mine itself. It begins to just consume itself. And one way I would characterize that is that there's a possibility space, and it can have billions, trillions, like finite but astronomical amounts of, the idea of sliders and whatnot is intriguing for sure. But one key difference that I would throw out there, that I think moves any form of AI that we have today very definitively in a different place than, say, culture and human generated content, and understanding for that matter, is that the possibility space, again to Ali's point, is very hard. It's delimited. The possibility space is closed. It doesn't, the data sets are essentially human generated as a byproduct of human effort. But the AI itself, intrinsically, I would argue, isn't going to evolve or keep up with being understanding or relevance, move towards relevance, in the sense that it in itself can contribute to how it relates to really existing environment or really existing culture. It's always necessarily that possibility space, no matter how astronomically big it is, how many variables it can entail. It'll always be delimited. And in the contrary, living systems constantly expand their possibility space. And they do it in a way that's very distinct from our machines today. They do it in a way in the sense of being sensitive to, sympathetic with, having affinities for their environments, for example. So humans and, as animals, we can't help but be very sensitive to our environments, whether that's cultural or natural. And that constantly in real time is updating the possibility space. We're constantly reacting to that possibility space, and each of us as individuals is fundamentally creative, intrinsically creative, in a way that the machine is not intrinsically creative. So the machine, as it's taking up more energy and taking up more of our focus, is essentially, I would argue, like to Ali's point, that it just it competes with our ability to generate relevance, is to ground these data sets in. It's just essentially, it's Baudrillard's argument, is that it's just putting Baudrillard's hyperreal on hyperdrive, and that we're that these machines are just going to automate. It's automated optimization, and so in terms of the balance of a living system needing to both explore and exploit, we're just exploiting. It is like occluding the exploring, and I don't mean exploiting necessarily even in a normative way, in a judgmental way. It's just, you need to explore and you need to exploit. I think the AI technologies are fantastically increasing our self-exploitation, and which does then, because it gets out of balance, then that's what makes it bad. That it occludes our ability to explore and expand not just the content generation, but also its relevance. Like, why is it relevant? And there's just a fundamental technological difference between our machines, which again are just automated optimization. They're not generative in the way that animals are generative, and that has very real implications for where this all goes. And again, I just harken back to whatever Baudrillard said about the downside of the hyperreal. I think is very much what we have to face.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with all of that too, because it's using it for consumer purposes. It definitely is exploiting who is consuming, in my opinion. And even then, when it comes to entrepreneurship, like the definition of an entrepreneur is just exploiting an opportunity. So it's one of those things that right now, yeah, it is the entrepreneurs who are innovating with this technology. So that's why I found Hartley's model so interesting to incorporate into this presentation, because he looks at competition as vital for a semiosphere. He looks as competition and this clashing of different creative industries as a positive thing. And sometimes we more or less look at it as a detrimental thing, that we don't want to clash against Amazon, as the state of New York, for instance. But this is how meaning is created, whether it's from the legislation aspect or from the actual artistic output aspect. So yeah, from the consumer centric approach, I do see it being more exploitative rather than explorative. But when it comes to design, I do think we could conceptualize along with it. But right now, the technology, it's not really, it has to know what is the environment in order to design with us in a way. Because sure, we can use these visual images of the city space as a jumping point of what we want to design as an architect. But to say that it's AI generated cities, it's kind of short-sighted, because all of it relies on human input for that matter. So yeah, I don't know. Hopefully in the future it could be more generative towards the actual experience of semiosis. Right now, I think it's more so trying to figure out how to incorporate itself into society. And right at the moment, it's consumerism is how it's easily being able to get socially acceptable. But when it comes to this hyperreal environment, yeah, that's where we have to go beyond this hyperreal aspect and go into what Fruchsiev talks about, transmodernism, and this sort of being in reality but still living within the hyperreal environment as well. So that would turn into a whole nother discussion, looking at this transmodernism approach with living with AI for that matter. Yeah. I think you're muted, Ali.
Okay. I'd like to come back to the schema that you showed in one of the first slides, actually, about the planetary boundaries. It was interesting in the sense that, yeah, I was actually expecting that you would talk about it a bit more. But I think we need to have like a maybe concept of AI as something that sort of incorporates this impact on these various parts of the planet, like, because AI is not just like a thing. It's like when I think about the schema that Kate Crawford and with a colleague, she mapped out Amazon Alexa's like this entire network of labor basically and resources that goes in there, and she defines AI or as basically something that activates this network of using non-renewable resources every time we use the systems, because like there's various flows of so first there is a hardware layer that even chips, I think they make like a couple of rounds around the earth before they are ready to be included in computers and so on. So like all this shipping system, and then there is the information, the data, datafication layers where, at first we'll have like this quantified culture or quantified biological data. And then also there is the data labeling, where people basically have to label large data sets for AI exactly so that the machine could learn better. And when you read like how this is done, is basically to the extent of like that it's difficult to understand what they are labeling, because obviously most of like image data, for example, is quite complex, and it doesn't always fall into these categories that programmers or engineers want to have. And so so it's all about like how you sort of categorize uncategorizable things or images or whatever like units for the AI system basically. So yeah, and when Josh said that it's increasing our level of self-exploitation, then this is also quite asymmetric, because I mean, yes, we can say that we as a humanity, we exploit ourselves actually in every manner to make those systems work, but this exploitation mostly falls on, not on the Western world, but everywhere else. So yeah, there's that. But yeah, the planetary boundaries, like I've been thinking about how to sort of envision this AI as like this planetary system, basically, of different flows of information, different relationships of significance and signification. And Therese was telling us last time, then every person who ever works with anything in this system, they actually come with their own, embodied and contextual worlds. So obviously, most of these are not taken into account, because it's whoever is paying for the building of the system is the one whose idea of the culture gets like objectified into it. So do you have any?
Well, yeah, it's one of those things that like I don't have an answer, because it's not just it's not just a one person strategy. It very much relies on like semioticians that have their own like cultural understanding, whether it's like where they live or where they used to live, because like these scientific truths, they're a global phenomenon, but yet we have to understand how to integrate them into each type of culture. And that's something where it's a lot, because like, you know, from like semiotic consulting, it is a good orientation onto how to align yourself with something that is not trying to exploit the human self, but actually trying to expand the human self. So when it comes to this transdisciplinary approach, like the Anthropocene is like at the core of transdisciplinary research. How we can overcome these boundaries that is limiting, you know, the future of mankind. Because even then, it's one of those things that like one strategy in US, for instance, might not work in Estonia. So it's knowing how we can translate these different interactions. Because sure, hydrogen self-powered vehicles sounds great. It sounds like we should have it in the entire world, but like the transportation system in Tartu is very much different than like anywhere in the South where I'm from. So it's one of those things that it very much relies on how we understand what is the environment, and how we can build off of this. Because it's not just a clear-cut approach of like, yep, this is what we need to do. It very much relies on, yeah, just a lot of clashing, you know. So that's in the future, that's really what I'm looking forward to, is understanding how to make these significant changes when it comes to these planetary boundaries. But Josh, you have something to add?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, great slide. It reminds me of, well, it does remind me, Ali, I think you mentioned her name. Was it, yeah, Kate Raworth,
Crawford.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Was it Crawford that talked about donut economics?
Oh, no, that's another.
Okay.
I will go on.
Yeah.
I will drop
Well,
it.
yeah. So yeah, so donut, this slide here reminds me of donut economics, who I think is popularized by Kate Raworth, and it's similar in the sense that it has this, as you've suggested in your notes, like there's this balance between social, you know, the social concerns and then ecological ceiling, and that there's a donut in that pressure. You know, there's the inner circle of the social concerns and desires, and then of course the boundary conditions of, you know, of the environment. But another to sort of flesh out this thing that I'm really interested in is the relevance and the sensitivity, and how it is the system becomes sensitive to its environment. Like how does that happen? As you suggest, Alec, you know, it does. I think we can all agree our systems, whether mechanical or other political or otherwise, need to be more sensitive to our environment, and ourselves to some degree. Third world countries, for example, and one of the ways to do that, one of the many ways to do that, is just as Ali was beginning to articulate, is like how it is you track embodied costs. You know, like right now we just have the luxury really of not even tracking that. You know, the interesting thing is that nature solved that problem by having metabolism. Metabolism essentially is highly sensitive to these bounding pressures. The human body, just to take, you know, a simple, not so simple example, you know, uses about 100 watts all the time. So our brain uses about 20 watts of that 100. And so no matter what we're doing, whether we're like really trying to push ourselves or really trying to explore, really trying to exploit, we're really trying to collaborate, we're really trying to compete, we're using the same energy. And that didn't happen by accident. There's a reason for that. And there's many layers of benefits of limiting yourself as an organism, because why not just, why did nature do that? Why is that kind of conservation mindset, conservation strategy, I guess I should call it, all the way down to the single cell organism? Why is that so pervasive throughout the phylogenetic tree? I think it's something that in AI, it's just the apex of a very long human tradition of optimization. And we're just really good at optimizing, but that has a dark side. And AI is just going to continue to shed light on that dark side. And as it occludes our ability to be sensitive to the embodied costs of not only hurting our own, fellow citizens on the planet, but also, not being aware of these boundaries that you've nicely articulated here. How do we build into not only our machines, but our political systems, for example? And I just call those technics. I think they're intimately related, and they're just human. That's just the nature of being human, is these techniques. All of our systems of systems. And how do they, there's a great study, a great number of studies that I found back in the day demonstrating that nature is not efficient. Like, she doesn't optimize. Optimization isn't what nature does, isn't what evolution does. It's that balance again between explore, exploit, collaborate, compete. These things are not good or bad. It's about the ratio in a certain context, in a certain place and time. And these studies were showing that if you look at like an ecosystem, they're probably, like, in terms of the balance between how much energy you use to maintain certain a number of functionalities, a whole range of functionalities that seem to be not relevant, like DNA, for example. We just keep calling 90% of it junk DNA. Well, it's not junk DNA. It's a diachronic heritage of what has worked, because we live in an indeterminate open system. And how do we build these kinds of logics that nature, again, these papers were saying that nature's maybe 40% efficient by our sort of human industrial logic. So I just want to just, based on this slide, just sort of open it up to the that AI is just one in a long line of human habits to optimize and be currently as it is now. And again, it's not even to blame AI. It's just one in a long line of being. How do we become more sensitive to things like energy? How do we become aware of truly the embodied costs and those suffering? The people suffering is on some level an index of consuming a lot of just going, not being aware of these boundaries, for example. How do we build that into both our machines and our institutions?
Yeah, and I think that's currently where we're at right now. Just knowing how to build it in,
I would add that what I thought is kind of, maybe it's necessary to add, maybe you agree that I don't know how optimized nature is, but this sort of thing, it becomes visible depending on how close you look at the phenomena. So maybe this sort of optimization or sort of balancedness, or what comes out of it, is visible only on a larger scale, but otherwise it seems like a stochastic or sort of random phenomenon. So this might be really relevant question in there. So in what cases do we see even the effect of AI, like an individual person, so how it may affect their conception of everything, and how it may actually play out on the large scale, because you might have totally unexpected patterns happening. So this, I think the same kind of question might apply in here.
It's also more generally the question of like how we delimit a product. Like, what is a product? How do we define a product? Is it just the thing that is? But because when they develop their products, they obviously consider, the chain of expenses, for example, or like the financial cost of a thing, per item or something like that. But like this more general idea is that, like, while they are using certain non-renewable resources or something that's can be also considered the Crawford calls them the commons, or so Earth is our common resource, and if you can use part of it without like paying to whom, right? Or let's just extract those resources and so yeah, like what is the actual cost, or what is the actual product? What is the actual cost of a product? Is it that we should just limit this to like financial cost, or is it actually like, the entire planetary cost of producing something that has an entire system, has a very asymmetrical impact on parts of the world that are not Europe and not the United States. So yeah.
I think
yeah, you can go, Josh.
Thanks. Again, this is my my PSA, my public services announcement for, I think I bring it up every time, so please forgive me for doing it once again. But I really think Peirce is super helpful with his agapistic evolution, his evolutionary love concept. It's just help frame these kinds of discussions, because he looks at it in terms of the degenerate cases of being algorithm and stochastic chance. And that it's interesting to note that, our machines, sort of the apex of our machines as they are now, are these alternations between algorithm and chance. But Peirce was very clear that these are degenerate cases of agapism, which is systems that evolve based on positive sympathies. And it's these positive sympathies that I believe are, well, I hesitate to call them the answer, but I think that that are, and I definitely hesitate to say that there's some optimal goal, some goal that we're looking for, or some, even the logic of cost is it's a logic of optimization. I would suggest that that our AIs and our machines and our institutions need to build somehow the ability to have positive sympathies that don't presuppose the right outcome. They're just more adept at being aware of all those aspects that cause the asymmetries that Ali's touching on. That these asymmetries are they're again an outcome of optimization, is that you're cohering on a particular set point in the possibility space. And when the attractor is, the limit attractor circling around this particular drain, it's the system becomes really asymmetric and also very brittle. And so that's really the risk, I think, for us as a species, is that as much as we like to pride ourselves in the ability to, look into space and look deep into the micro realm, we're kind of missing the forest for the trees, and it's just our nature. We're still not sensitive to that meso scale that's resolving the micro and the macro, which life has been doing for almost 4 billion years. And I just again suggest that it's building in this third thing that's not an algorithm, not a law, not an optimization, and nor is it just purely randomization, just adding variety for the sake of variety. There's a third thing here that's missing in all of these systems. And how do we do that is a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you about the agapism. And it's exactly what, Farouk Seif, that's something who I talk about all the time as well too, about the design aspect of integrating design thinking with the doctrine of signs. Because when we have something so planetary like this, as the planetary boundaries, but how do we actually bring it into our day-to-day life, and how can we actually model self versus others, beyond not just my culture, but beyond the additional culture as well? Because with this, the goal of to help with the process of cultural perception, that's like the first barrier that it's a challenge, because it's something where the perception and action, this relates more towards the Umwelt and the relations of the environment that the Umwelt is in. But if the consumer takes a stance, for instance, that That's just how things are. That's what I want to do. How are you supposed to change this cultural perception? And you know, if you can't change the perception, you can't really expect to create a different action. So it's more so, and even when it comes to being immersed into technology, you know, what one of my papers wrote about last or earlier this year is about like when we become immersed, you know, we are entering the imaginative void of the designer. So when we are just being immersed with our relations of AI, we are experiencing this void that comes from the designer's mind. We aren't actually establishing a relation with like the objective nature. So like within this Umwelt and an Umwelt, it's intended to help us understand how we can go beyond this paradox of being put into this hyperreal box. But how can we actually contribute to this evolving and this creative love of the world that we live in? So that's something where this design, you know, it very much focuses on transparency. And I very much enjoy this model because it shows pretty straightforward what aspects we are good at the moment and which aspects are at a point of irreversible actions. So when it comes to this whole cynicism approach of like the continuous reality, it's it's pretty straightforward on which ones we need to try to combat first before we get to the next stage. But again, this relies on the policymaking, the consumer awareness, the cultural structuring around it, and so on. It's not just like a one individual thing, and so on. But when it comes to utilizing AI, I think the biggest aspect is how we can understand how this technology, how to not go into the void of the designer, who we don't even know who the designer is for that matter, but how we can use this technology to make us designers of our own environment. So how to incorporate more understandings of like how to incorporate biodiversity into the environment we live in, or to understand our actual impact of our electricity usage or freshwater usage. There's little things that I think we can do on the day-to-day basis to understand from the individual perspective, but also from the cultural perspective. But you know, it's that will take time and energy, essentially.
Yeah, maybe it's good to finish with that thought. Any final words?
Nothing from me. Yeah, it was I definitely enjoyed talking about this topic. It's something that from my point of view, I enjoyed looking at it and to discover what I found. But in the future, I do see this sort of research as ability for like a book publication, you know, something that like, you know, just modeling the current state of AI and the semiosphere. Whether you know, you can definitely use the typical Lotmanian approach of identifying, you know, the asymmetrical boundaries and so on, the what aspects of translatability things are non-translatable, because identifying what's the non-translatable aspects will help us understand the actual implications of like fixing the planetary boundaries, which things, you know, just won't translate into other cultures for that matter. So I don't know, in the future, I do hope that there is like a book about related to semiotics and AI specifically, but specifically looking at the semiosphere, because I do find it as a central model to understand how we are creating and innovating and evolving with this technology. So with Hartley's model, I do find it significant, not only in terms of how we create with this technology, but what we should envision for like ownership, such as giving the creative user more freedom or giving them more ownership in their artistic expressions, and how to make culture a part of the intellectual property discussion. That's something where I do hope semiotics can contribute to this heterogeneous aspect of meaning making, rather than making it a universal system, because that's I don't think any of us really want to experience that sort of universality and to that sort of extent. So yes, if you ever want to do contributing, if you ever want to do partnering research, let's talk more and figure out how we could potentially do some sort of book publication of looking at AI in the semiosphere, because I think that'd be very useful.
Yeah, it sounds a bit ambitious, but yes, we definitely need
Yeah.
these kind of approaches. Anyway, I hope the seminar series contributes a little bit towards building up something that can be formalized later into a text. Anyway, but yeah, well, as always, don't want to stop the conversation. Not really, but we have to. So until the next time, thank you, Alec, very much for your interesting presentation and all the discussion. There is a lot of food for thought.
Yeah.
And now, as in 3 weeks, we have all kinds of other obligations and events and conferences coming up. So there won't be like a session in 3 weeks, but the next official Technosemiotics seminar will be August 21. But on August 7th, which is also a Monday, a couple of hours earlier, we will have like an extra intermittent session, which will be more like a panel about various experiences that people have with generative AI. So there will be a number of guests on that, and everybody else is also very welcome to share your impressions and experience that you've had with any kind of generative systems. So yeah, that's in like 5 weeks now, I think, or something. So yeah, or 7. No, not sure. I can't count. Anyway, August 7th, and then August 21. But yeah, thank you everyone for being here and for questions and participants, and yeah, see you next time.